Hello? I have some notes that I need to refer to, so if I don't make eye contact with you, don't be offended. So before I get started, I just wanted to thank Mark and Thibaut and the rest of the Fruition team for having me here. I've been following Fruition Sciences since pretty much the beginning, although not with the sap flow, just as following the climate information. It's super interesting. I have to admit, though, that it's a little bit intimidating coming up here after all these smart people just spoke. Even though I've been following them for a long time, I find myself sometimes struggling to keep up. I am a Pinot Noir and Chardonnay winemaker, so my experience with the harvest of 2017 in Sonoma County, I also work in other places, was a bit different than some of the Cabernet people in the room. I was glad to see that at some point during the morning's proceedings that it was pointed out that the Pinot Noir, or the early variety experience, was quite different than the later variety experience. And my experience with the 2017 season certainly was not as dire as Rob's. Let me just, I'm not used to doing this PowerPoint thing, so hopefully I won't get too in the weeds with this. There we go. So my observations with the season are pretty much mirror what everybody else has said. A wet winter, high early season vigor, which I actually was sort of happy to see after all these years of drought. There was the mildew thing, which is obviously not a good thing. I did have some concern that the large canopies might be difficult to support later on. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then it got really hot, as we saw in June and July, which might not have been a bad thing. August was quite mild, and for early variety guys like me, like Pinot and Chardonnay guys, it was a godsend. We were all a little bit afraid of what might happen if it didn't cool off. And then, of course, the Labor Day heat wave. After seeing some of what was presented today and thinking a bit more when I was just sitting over there listening, it did feel like to me that the Labor Day heat wave turned it into two different harvests. And a lot of the Pinot and Chardonnay harvest came before the Labor Day weekend. So I think a lot of what I have to say might seem kind of contradictory to some of the stuff that was presented today. But anyway, that's I'm not making it up. It was true. So there's a picture of some happy vines. I think anybody that spent time in the vineyard this year saw a lot of this. As I mentioned before, I wasn't totally unhappy to see this happen. It was kind of a refreshing change from dealing with water and nutrient stress, which had been the case in the years of the drought. Plus, we're fairly good, I think, at dealing with high vigor situations. If you've got excess water, it's a little bit easier to combat vigor than to not have any water at all and have the vines need more. And this picture was from kind of early June, right before it got hot. And then it did get hot for quite a while. And one comment about the heat, and this was alluded to a little bit earlier, the heat spells seem to me to be different in distribution than they were most years. For example, there was a graphic that said that Carneros was one of the cooler or the least impacted of the Sonoma County area growing regions, and that certainly followed my experience this year, but that's usually not the case. Carneros, I think, is generally thought of as a warmer growing region than the Russian River or certainly the Sonoma coast. But in general, it was hot everywhere. And this picture, taken from a somewhat stressed site in the Sonoma coast, you would think that the heat was probably kind of a good thing. The canopies were in good shape. You can see the canes are browning off nicely. This is a Pinot Noir vineyard that it was probably right around the end of Veraison. I was a little bit worried that because it went through Veraison during the heat, that there might be some unevenness, possible problems related to that, but it wasn't visual, or wasn't apparent visually. And I think I certainly felt pretty good about where the vines are at after the heat, going into those critical weeks leading up until harvest. Let's go to the next slide. As I mentioned, August was mild, and it was mild pretty much for the entire month. That was good for Pinot guys. I did have some, as I might have alluded to earlier, had some concern about the large canopies, and there's a lot of talk about that this morning's presentations. And it kind of took me back to the 2002 season, which was not nearly as hot as 2017. But I did see examples, mostly in Pinot, and in more than one place, both Carneros and the Sonoma Coast, of vineyards that seemed to be either stressing or shutting down early. And even though it was a small crop, at least with the vineyards that I was working with in 2002, the wine quality was a little bit disappointing. Of course, and in mid-August, we didn't know if it was going to get hot again during August. And even though a Labor Day heat wave is pretty much the norm around the North Coast, and to some extent we planned for it, we didn't know, or I didn't know, if it might get hot before then. Now the season was tracking, early-ish. There was a lot of stuff that I work with in the Sonoma Coast that was getting close to, or that I was anticipating picking around the end of August, and that turned out to be true. And as I was evaluating the vineyard samples, going kind of in the middle of August, things were looking good. Sugar was accumulating fairly slowly. Acids were good. Certainly, the condition of the fruit was really good, and I was feeling fairly optimistic about the prospects for 2017. I started picking in earnest. We picked a little bit of stuff for rosé, kind of on the early side, but I started picking grapes for Pinot and Chardonnay around August the 26th, so about a week before it got really hot. And the early returns were quite good. I would say that there was some hint both in some of the vineyard samples and in just sort of evaluating stuff when it was on the skins in the fermenters, red with Pinot, that the tannins may not be as optimally ripe as they could have been, but nothing that was really too alarming. And so we picked most of the Sonoma Coast and Chardonnay Pinot that I work with by August 31st, which, as you know, was when all hell broke loose with the heat wave. When I went back to taste through all the wines and review my tasting notes, when I compared them to the dates that they were harvested, that kind of two different harvest thing became pretty apparent to me. And the wines really kind of grouped themselves into two, but maybe 2.5 groups. Everything that came in before the heat wave, which was mostly Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, mostly Sonoma Coast and Carneros, was quite good. I would say that there was no evidence of decoupling of sugar and color. The fruit was in really good condition. And with now that I go back and taste the wines after they've been in the cellar for a few months, they're quite promising. Maybe not quite as concentrated as the 2015 and 2016 wines, but generally good. The part of the harvest that I think was the most perplexing for me was the time right after the heat wave, and then kind of going maybe a week after that. So say around September the 3rd to the 10th or something like that. There were some vineyards that I worked with that were kind of close to being ready to pick, say around, 20 bricks or something like that, but were kind of needed another week to 10 days. Other vineyards that were a little bit further away, maybe I didn't have to think about them so much that I was planning on picking them later in September. But the impact in that week right after the heat wave was really kind of counterintuitive to me. Stuff that was pretty much ready to pick right before the heat, that for a variety of reasons we let sit, came through the heat surprisingly well, even to the extent that it didn't have much dehydration or raisiny flavors or super high bricks. And the flavors were good, color was good, and the quality was almost as good as if we had picked it before the heat. And you would think, well, fruit that was almost ready to pick was probably at its most vulnerable stage, prone to being shriveled up and things like that, but that was not the case. Fruit that was maybe around 20 bricks and was not quite ready, but would have been ready around the end of this period, say around the 10th, was actually what suffered the most. What you might think would be a little bit less prone to shriveling up because berries were a little bit firmer. But it kind of had that classic high sugar, not quite there flavor, not quite as concentrated as you might hope. Perhaps, and there was some information presented earlier that suggested that it takes two weeks after a heat event to recover, and this is not quite exactly the same situation, but maybe I should have just waited longer. But those vineyards were starting to look kind of sad, so I ended up pulling the trigger. Now, those wines, these kind of troubled wines that came in at high sugar, but maybe compromised in ripening, have improved some in the cellar. They're, I would say the color is not as good, and as we are seeing a few times this morning, color is a good or can be a good proxy for quality. The flavors are not damaged that much. There's not really much in the way of raisiny flavors or dehydration, or kind of dehydration-related flavors. But there wasn't a whole lot of true ripening going on in that week, that I kind of waited before I picked in. But when we get to the later ripening vineyards, and there was a lot of non-Pinot Pinot Noir picked in this period, and just a few kind of late ripening Pinot vineyards. This is when the decoupling of sugar and color was the most evident to me. In almost every case, I ended up needing to wait a bit longer, maybe than I felt comfortable before picking. And again, the wines kind of fell into two camps, and I haven't totally sorted out exactly why it played out in this way. But in some cases, two cases, notably one Pinot Noir and one Cabernet vineyard that I work with, waiting for flavor ripeness kind of took me into the realm of shriveling and dehydration with kind of the expected compromises there. But in most cases, what compromised the fruit or the quality of the wine wasn't so much heat damage or dehydration or raisiny flavors. It was more kind of lack of concentration and sort of optimally ripe flavors. And in some cases, I waited a really long time. And that's sort of, that sounds very much like what Thibaut was talking about with this decoupling of sugar and color or sugar and secondary metabolites. And I don't know that waiting forever, they may never have gotten there. And also, actually, just say it as an aside, the sort of the 8 million pound gorilla in the room, which was the fires. Luckily, I didn't have to deal with that. All the fruit, I'm an early variety guy, so I know Eric is going to talk about that a little bit later, but I don't have much to say about the fires, at least not this year. I did back in 2008. A couple of somewhat random comments. A lot of people talk about wanting to model your extractions on differences in how the fruit ripens, and the sort of all the stuff that we've already talked about. The way I make all those decisions is kind of, well, I wouldn't say on the fly, but it's very much kind of in response to the fruit as it comes in. And so I was thinking a little bit about this last night, and I didn't really notice doing things differently in response to the fairly extreme kind of differences in the wine composition that we had this year, other than the approach to the picking decisions, which I've already described. I think that, and I don't do much Cabernet, and I didn't do a lot of extended maceration, so I can't really speak to that. I would say, kind of as a final comment on the wines in general, when I look at them on the whole, that the stuff that came in before Labor Day, as I said before, was quite good. and maybe not quite as good as 2016, but good, and it's still early. And then everything, especially the later stuff that came after that, kind of that critical 1 week period, right after the worst of the heat, that's much more of a mixed bag and in more predictable ways. I haven't said much about white wine. I do make a fair bit of Chardonnay. That didn't seem to be very affected at all, surprisingly, other than a little bit of a brick spike in the stuff that came in right around the heat wave, and even during the heat wave, we actually picked a little bit of Chardonnay during the heat. Pick at night, so it was at least the fruit came in cold, and the flavors are good. And even with the whites that came in, kind of towards the end of harvest, mid-late September. I didn't find the problems, and these were not so much Chardonnay, but Rhone whites, Marsanne, Sonoma Vigne. I didn't find any sort of difficulties with getting good ripe flavors and having reasonably balanced chemistry and that sort of thing. So I don't know if this echoes what other people's experiences were. I know Rob didn't have much fun with his Chardonnay, and the whites that I've just referred to were not, in some cases, they were not even from Sonoma County, but they were from pretty warm areas. So I'll throw that out to the room to you guys to talk about. So I sense that my time is up. Do I have that right? Pardon me? Yeah. So what I was going to say is, are there any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Did you water those vineyards before the heat spike?
In most cases, they're not vineyards that I own, but in most cases, we tried to be pretty proactive with irrigation prior to the heat. We knew it was coming, but not everybody was as willing to put water.
So it's Pinot Noir, so you're watering it that late date. You think that play out in the concentration that you're seeing late before harvest.
Yeah, I have not found that to be the case, and when I've advocated it, maybe we're not putting on enough to dilute the flavors, and certainly watering right before the heat, if you're going to pick in a few days, it's not particularly effective anyway. But it seems to me that the trade-off between coaxing the vines through a heat wave is probably worth potentially a little bit of dilution. Other questions? Yes?
I'm sitting here wondering about, when you say that you had less color, I'm wondering whether you looked at the bleachable pigment.
I did not. This is strictly observations on what I saw coming into the winery.
Yeah, it's the same question I have about the other crop. It seems like the terms anthocyanin and color are being used interchangeably, and they're completely different. So it may be, and I see this with a lot of Pinot producers, that they think they don't have much color, but in fact what they have is monomer color, which is only visible at maybe 20% at normal wine pHs. And so if you just put a little acid in it, you may find that you have a whole lot more color than you think.
The somewhat maybe less than intuitive thing about the color question with the wines that I made this year is, with only a couple of exceptions, Pinot was not the one that suffered from a lack of color. Were some of the other varieties that I worked with, some Rhone varieties and things like that, which was a surprise. I mean, I was expecting there to be more, at least potential problem with color, but it's so far, I mean, this could change. The wines haven't been in barrel that long, but so far it seems to be okay. Anybody else? Yes? Production? Reduction. No, it seemed, at least in my cellar, which is not, certainly isn't comprehensive for the entirety of Sonoma County, it seemed like there was less reduction than average, if you will, and pretty cooperative fermentations. All my stuck wines are from someplace outside of Sonoma County. Anything else? Thank you very much.